All right, so right here, I've got my AppNav component from News Site 6 this morning. So right now, it's a class-based component using the useContext consumer. So I'm going to first npm run start to get this, get the server started, and then I'll turn this into a functional component. All right, so while that's happening, I'm going to comment this out and uncomment the functional version. Still leave that export default appNav. All right. So should still be working, more or less. All right, just isn't doing any of that context stuff. So in order to add context to a functional component, there is a hook specifically for that. One sec, I need to add someone to the breakout room. All right, so there is a hook that I need to specifically import. So up here at the top, I am going to have my import statement. It's going to be import useContext from React. And in order to make use of that, I need to define it over here, kind of like you would with useState. I would say const, we can call this one userContext equals useContext. And the context it's going to be using is still our userContext that we made earlier. And so what we used for this useContext for earlier is conditional rendering, depending on whether you're going to show a login page or a logout link, and whether or not we would allow someone to add an article. So again, I can do some conditional rendering here, where I could say, this would be userContext.user, so whether or not it exists. So if it does exist, we will have our nav items here. And if it doesn't, we'll have a login, so that'll be a link to equals / login like so. Let's see if I did that correctly. All right, so I've got a login thing here. Second, right, another person to add to the breakout room. All right, so for those of you who just joined, I've got my functional version of AppNav here. And the one thing I changed from what it was before is I added this. I imported useContext from React. And then I said, I defined a variable called userContext, which is equal to useContext, and the argument is the userContext that I made earlier. And now I have some conditional rendering here saying if userContext has a user, then I want to render the add article page. If not, I want to render the login. So again, if I log in, should be john@doe.com, open sesame. Now it says add an article because the context is switched. So as you can see, a functional component makes that a lot easier because all you have to do is just save it to a variable essentially, and then you can access it kind of like we do up here, except we did up here, except you don't need to add this user context fat arrow parentheses in the user context.consumer. So what questions do you have about use context in functional components?
Are a lot of these like functional conversions this easy?
Uh, I would say, I don't want to say for sure, however, generally speaking, converting between a class-based component and a functional component, all of the logic should be pretty much the same. It's just a matter of how you implement it. So in terms of context, it does get a lot easier because all you need to just say is user context equals use context. But for something like our add article page here, all right, we have our class-based component. We don't really need to worry about, we have that state redirect, we have that state here that can be done with hooks. You'd still have your handle form submit that would look pretty much the same as before. You wouldn't have to change anything about this in a functional component. Yeah, it would be pretty much the same in many ways. So we have like the functional version here, except without the context so far. If we take a look at it, and you have that redirect, you have use state here instead. Handle form submit looks the same. And then the return statement is there's a redirect. If redirect is true, you redirect to the home page. Otherwise, you render all of this stuff just like before. So converting really shouldn't be that difficult, I think. I wouldn't want to say that it's never difficult, but that is pretty much how it works.
I have a question, Noah.
Yeah.
So it says user context dot user. That dot user, is that something? Where did that dot user attribute come from?
Good question. So when we defined our user context in usercontext.js, we would say that the context has something called user and something called set user. And by default, they're set to null and just an empty function. And then when we went to app.js and created our user context provider, we created a user and set it to this.state.user. So whatever user is set to state in app is also true for the provider. And we set the set user function to this.handle login, which literally just is a set state function.
Okay, so where is at this point, like if someone creates credentials to log on to the website, where are those being stored?
Those are being stored here as user. So if we take a look at our, we go to our inspector and take a look at, if it lets me, there we go, components. So app in state, all right, right now user is set to null, but if I log in, open sesame. So now user is stored here as this dictionary. It's got a created ID, something called TTL, and user information and user ID. And in this case, yes.
So it's saved on our web server then, and not like when like we scale this eventually, like will we ever save credentials in a database or?
So you don't want to save them to a database per se, and you're going to save your users' user information in a database, their passwords and usernames, and that'll all be encrypted. But this kind of information here, like the I forgot the token, and the user's login information. You could save that that's often saved in cookies. That's one very common use case for cookies. It's also, you can also save it in local storage is another option. So it is saved, and it's essentially saved by the browser. Because remember, HTTP is always stateless, meaning it can never keep track of it can never keep track of anything. So it's on the browser to keep track, okay, do I still have this login credential or not? And if I do, then I can just keep on. Essentially, you're constantly logging into a website when you're using it.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you.
No problem. All right, Heather, I know you are a little late to the party, so I'll just go over it again real quick. So I created a functional version of AppNav here. And I added this thing. useContext is a hook that you can import from React. And I set that equal to userContext equal to that using my userContext thing. And then after that, it was pretty much the same as it was before. I have conditional rendering here saying if userContext has a user, we render the add article page link. Otherwise, we render the login link. All right, any other questions I can answer?
How much more of hooks are we going to be like learning, or is this are we getting toward the end of like the relevant parts of it?
I don't know if we have any more lessons coming up that are specifically about hooks, because next week we're starting on how to develop a full stack app, so with a Django backend. So there are lots of other hooks, but I think we've covered the ones we'll most commonly use, which are useState, useEffect, and now useContext.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
No, where did you import user from? Where is that coming from?
Import user, meaning the userContext.user?
Yes, sir. Yeah, the user. No import, but yeah, just the user. What is that coming from? On line 53, yeah, right there,
Yep.
user context, yeah.
So all of the setup we did here with the userContext.provider value equals this, all this stuff, that gives anything that has that user context access to this object, including user and set user. So in my app nav here, since I set user context equal to use context, so that gives me access to that user context, which gives me access to user context.user and user context.set user if I wanted to use it.
Got it now. Thank you.
No problem. All right, what other questions can I answer? I'm happy to do it.
I know that app is kind of boilerplate, right?
Yep.
But if when we run app, can we say that like first it goes to the app or it goes somewhere else and comes to the app.js?
So in terms of like when you run
Like
the
a
page,
steps, yeah,
Mhm.
like it's yeah.
Yeah, let me think about that for a second. So kind of the base of your project happens at index.js actually.
Okay.
So this is the root of the entire project. And it says we render the app component, document.element by ID, and then app renders everything else. So yeah, my understanding of it is essentially that you've got app at the very base, and then everything else kind of sprouts out from app like a tree. Does that make sense?
Yes. And also like why we are dividing like pages and components, like because I see they're like the same.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's mainly just for organizational purposes. Because yes, pages and components, they have this, like, functionally, they don't have any real differences between them. The only difference is how we're using them and for what purpose. So typically, we've been using pages to represent new URLs. So when we go to localhost 3000/section/world or localhost 3000/add article, we say, okay, the base of each of these is a page. And each of these pages can be made up of multiple components. So one way to think of a page, like here, is it kind of fulfills a similar purpose that app does. App is the base of our program, and each page is the base of like a section of our website. So for example, the section page, which we're on right now, has list group, article teaser, list group, article teaser. It has all this stuff right here. And if I click on one of these links, now I'm on an article page, which has an article component, and that article component has other components. So again, there's nothing that says you have to have these inside pages, and nothing that says you have to have all of these in components. You could have all of them in one big folder if you really wanted to, but by dividing them up into folders, one for pages, one for components, it makes it easier to scale your application, because then everything is in its own specialized area, even if it doesn't actually change the functions. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
No problem. Okay, what other questions can I answer?
So for the, I guess, user context thing, that's the same thing as passing props down, like the user prop state from app to the app nav, and then just doing that. Is there a reason this is so much better? Or?
Yeah, so going from app to app nav is pretty simple because it's rendered like that.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say, for example, that we had something on homepage, and homepage had a component and that component was what really needed to access the user. If we didn't have context, we would need to pass in something from app to homepage as props, and then from homepage to that other component as props again. By using this user context, we can just access it directly by using that context. So that way you don't have this kind of waterfall effect of having to go from here to here to here to here to here. You just say, nope, I know exactly what I need. I'm going to grab it directly from the source. Does that make sense?
On that page, you would just have to like import the context thing and then just use it?
Yep. As long as whatever rendered it was inside of this user context provider ultimately. So you could have, it doesn't have to be put right here, but, something that if you did user context, homepage, et cetera, as long as what it ultimately leads back here to the user context provider, it all has access to it.
So it just has to be wrapped in all that, you mean?
Exactly. So anything wrapped inside user context provider has access to the context, including anything that all of this renders as well.
Can you have multiple of those with multiple wrappings, or like individual wrappings of each different things?
Good question. I'm not sure. I've never tried. I suppose you could, but you could also probably just have more than just these values stored in user context provider. So yeah, I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that, but maybe
It'd be easier to put in that one file, you mean?
Yeah, that's my understanding, but
Gotcha.
Maybe in a more complex project, maybe you would want multiple contexts.
Thanks.
No problem. Great. No other questions I can answer while you all got me here?
I think you already answered this. Just to make sure. So all these components now can have access to the user context, right? Like the home page, article page.
Yep,
like
exactly.
Log in, log out. Okay.
Yeah, so long as I wired them up with the user context, either the way I did it here or the way I did it on AppNav. Like you need to do that wiring up in order for it to actually access these. But once you do that, they all has access to that information.
Okay. So just that hook. As long as you put that hook there, we will be fine.
Yep,
Cool.
As long as you put that hook, or you do the either a class-based component, you can do either the .context type or the other way of doing it.
And I know Redux, you were saying, is something kind of completely different, but does it do pretty much the same kind of thing in a different way?
Yeah, Redux does a very similar thing in a different way. I would argue it's probably more powerful than context. But in order to use Redux effectively, you essentially need to change how your entire application is structured. So it's very, very useful, and I would recommend looking into it. But we taught Redux at the previous bootcamp I taught at, and nobody liked it because it was just like so much like, okay, everything you learned about React, we kind of have to throw out the window a bit if you want to use Redux, and so nobody used it in their final projects. Even though it was so useful, it was just, you know, such a different way of looking at things, such as I'm glad we have the context here, because it's still part of React as opposed to an outside library. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm glad we did this breakout room. Thank you for suggesting that. You know, Tom and myself and all the TAs were all available if you have any further questions. But for now, I'm going to stop the recording. I'll put this up on YouTube.